Welcome to another episode of the BioHub. Today we have an outstanding guest. Over 40 years in healthcare capital markets with 31 years on Wall Street, currently serves on 6 biotech boards, including Indivior and MINK. She has raised over $1.5 billion for emerging biopharma companies in IPOs, follow-ons, and convertible debt transactions. She is also the founder of Fabulous Pharma Females, a non-profit dedicated to advancing and mentoring women in biopharma. Honestly, I'm so happy about some of the topics we can talk about today as I welcome Barbara Ryan. Thanks for being here, Barbara. How are you?
I'm great, Max. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you. Appreciate it.
No, honestly, a pleasure. Let's kick it off with the first question. So can you share with us the key milestones and moments in your career that have shaped your journey in healthcare capital markets?
Absolutely. I think, first and foremost had to be where I started. And when I was a freshman in college in 2017, I had the opportunity to have a summer internship at Bear Stearns. My father had been a portfolio manager and did business with Bear Stearns, and they had no nepotism. So often kids would wind up, getting those opportunities. And I stayed there for 4 years. I spent all my summers and Christmases at Bear Stearns, and in fact took one semester off and worked there and lived in Manhattan while I was in college. And at the time, Alan Schwartz, who's now the vice chairman at Guggenheim, was the director of research. And I had the opportunity to not only pursue a potential career on Wall Street, which is what I felt I wanted at the time, but I also got to experience what it was that actually each different division in an investment bank did. And I went in thinking that I wanted to do investment banking. And I thought that I was a research analyst for over 30 years, as you said. And I thought that that was probably some nerd that sat in a closet and read books and did research. And I didn't think, well, I don't think that's for me. Investment banking sounds far more exciting. And I knew I didn't want to be a salesman or a trader. But what I found out through those 4 years is that research was really at the nexus of the organization. And they basically did the analysis and made the calls that then the sales force went out to the Bell Alleys and State Streets and, Wellingtons of the world. And so it was actually a really exciting place. And yeah, you did a lot more work, did models, wrote reports, did a lot of research, but you were interacting with the entire ecosystem. So I was interacting with the sales force. I was interacting with the investment bankers. I was interacting with the clients. And more importantly, I was interacting with the senior leadership of the large cap pharma industry, which is what I covered, initially and throughout my career. So that 4 years gave me the opportunity to really land in a spot that was really a good fit for me. And what I initially thought I wanted to pursue probably wouldn't have been. So that was one. And, I'm a senior in college, and Alan Schwartz calls me on the phone and says, do I want to come in and interview in New York for a position as a research associate? And I'm like, oh my God, yes, of course. And so, that was sort of how the whole thing started. So that was definitely, a big milestone. And while I joined Bear Stearns at 17 years old, I stayed there till I was 30 years old. So I would say the second largest was making the decision, which was hard, to leave Bear Stearns. And at the time, I went short for 2 years to Prudential and then wound up at Alex Brown, which became Deutsche Bank. And all in there, I was about 21 years. But while I had tremendous opportunity and loved working at Bear Stearns, the man who gave me my big opportunity was, his name was Joe Ricardo, and he was large cap pharma analyst at Bear Stearns at the time. And I worked for him for 9 years. But when I turned 30, I was always going to be viewed in everyone there's eyes as Joe's little girl. And even though I was a senior analyst in my own right, I realized that I really had to repop myself in order to just have the appropriate franchise of my own and independence. So for that reason, I decided to do that. And then I would say the last is what brought me to end my career as an analyst after 31 years. And I think part of it was after 31 years. And, I didn't think that I was really at the edge of my seat the way I felt a lot of my career. Having done this all of my life, literally since I was 17, I thought, well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do anything else. So it was a little bit scary. And I was probably, I don't know, in my very early 50s at the time. But I thought, I'll never find out what else I'm qualified to do unless I leave doing this and figure that out. So that's what I did. And I spent a period of discovery, just meeting with, CEOs, bankers, people I had known, clients over the years to figure out where I could add value. And it ultimately became in my capital markets consulting business, and primarily working with emerging biotech companies. Often those companies have first-time CEOs, first-time CFOs. They may have run multi-billion-dollar businesses within large cap pharma, but they never had a tin cup in their hand and had to go raise money literally to survive and fight another day or to complete a clinical trial. They didn't necessarily know the investors, particularly in the emerging space. And maybe they were good storytellers and maybe they weren't. And maybe they didn't understand the language that we speak on Wall Street and how important your words are, how carefully you have to choose them, because once you choose them, you have to live by them. And so working either as de facto the entire investor relations effort at an organization or in support of what existed, and really joined at the hip for the most part with the CEO and CFO. It used all the skills I had. I wasn't writing research reports anymore. I was writing press releases to tell a story to the same audience. I could introduce all of these companies to investment banks, bankers, analysts, and investors. And instead of covering 15 different companies, I was really dedicating most of my efforts to a very small number of companies as I represented to, whoever the stakeholders happened to be. And I got an opportunity to be part of companies as like the seventh employee. And then we raised $1 billion and grew to 650 and launched our first drug and displaced the leader in the market. I had no operational. I was always looking at Merck, Lilly, Pfizer from the outside. I wasn't inside while they were making the sausage. And when you're inside a small company, sometimes the sausage making can be quite frightening. And what I learned was it's not if something will go wrong, it is inevitably when something goes wrong. And then it's all about how do you deal with it, which was the same thing I learned. I get woken up by the trader in the morning and Merck's going to have an analyst call at 7:30. What do you think they're going to say? And I'm like, oh my God, they are going to pull Vioxx off the market. And they're like, what? Why do you think that? And of course, you just have to dig right down into what does that really mean? What do we go out and tell investors? What's the impact? Where should the stock trade? And so you're always pivoting and having to respond in real time. And what I did learn over 43 years of doing this is it's much easier to trust your gut, because a lot of these things, there is no formulaic approach. But your institutional memory, like I've seen this movie before, and, here are the sequences of events, and here's where, we need to pivot, or here's where, if we make the wrong decisions, things can go rapidly south. And I also think that you develop, because of all those things, because you trust that I've been in this war more times and for longer periods of time than probably most of the people I'm interacting with. So you learn to, that you could be wrong. You don't know the right answer, but you learn to trust your judgment. And I think the ability to do that, people are looking for someone that they can trust their judgment and follow and lead. And so, you have to be very humble about the fact that you don't have all the answers, but I think the following, I think we do these three things, and here's why. Because
Yeah.
And it's the collective totality, and it's not just one company. You know, you've been exposed to 20 plus companies and seen how the actions, you know, I mean, a great example that probably anyone could relate to, unless they're drastically younger than me, is, you know, the Tylenol tampering, and the way that J&J stood up the organization behind that with tremendous urgency, integrity, and they actually came out of that as a stronger company and brand for those reasons, because consumers, rather than feeling afraid and that they weren't necessarily, so the opposite might be how our government handled COVID and the COVID vaccine, right? So people left that not trusting what they were hearing coming out of different people's mouths. And part of that is the inconsistency of what came out of people's mouths. So I think that's another really, really important part in capital markets is, I'll go back to what I said earlier, you know, choose your words very, very carefully. You will have to live by them. And words have meaning, and you have to understand the meaning that they have to the audience you're targeting, because they're not always the same.
Yeah. I mean, I love these kind of conversations because biotech's a business where, yes, it's about the science, the technology, and getting that all through. But, you know, remembering that these are businesses at the end of the day, I think is also a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, investors are trying to figure out where the best technology is, you know, what the regulatory risks are, what the commercial opportunity is. And those bars they're all rising over time in our industry, just given the collective number of companies and I mean, there are probably 1,800 cell and gene therapy trials going on. So it gives you a glimpse into the level of competition in an area of technology, which is really at the bleeding edge. So there's so much more that we don't know than we do know, right? So I think you have that first and foremost. What's the asset? How do I value it? What's the probability of success? But then, you know, people invest behind people at the end of the day, because the same asset in two different groups' hands will likely not have the same outcome, because there's so many decisions that have to occur along the course of that.
Yeah.
And there's two levels to it. It's one's confidence in the capabilities of those leaders and their experience. How many times have they been derailed and had to pivot and problem solve? And, you know, it's like they say in sports, that's why they play the game. On any given Sunday, the outcome can be incredibly surprising despite the odds. And it's the same in drug discovery. Okay, so you go into a phase 2 or 3 clinical trial, you've designed your protocol with all the things you know in mind, and then something unexpected happens when this drug is exposed to dramatically more people, because at each stage of development, the number of patients that you're treating goes up substantially. And when you start out, you're studying the safety in healthy volunteers. Now you're going into definitively defining the best dose in the targeted patient population, which may have a lot of other comorbidities. And so all bets are off. That's why things happen in once drugs are launched that are surprising relative to the clinical data, because it's no longer a controlled environment. People aren't necessarily taking the drug the way they're supposed to. They may have comorbidities that say you shouldn't be doing that. They may be going to 4 doctors, none of whom crosstalk, and they're taking drugs that clearly are contraindicated, and yet they don't know it. And so bad things happen.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's crazy. You talk about things like that, and then, you know, the capital market side of things as well. It kind of going on to that, with over 3 decades on Wall Street, how have you seen the landscape of healthcare capital markets evolve and change?
Yeah, and I would I would just characterize that my comments probably are most appropriate for biopharma, only because that's where I've lived my life, it's also very, very different in terms of the complexity and the regulatory issues and pricing than healthcare services, for example. So I'll just, make that caveat, although some things are general and applicable to all of healthcare. I think that the most obvious thing is that everything has become so much more sophisticated and complex and competitive. And I start with, we didn't really have a public biotech market when I started out my career in research when I graduated school, which was 1981. You had companies like Genentech and Amgen that were working to develop and launch their first drugs. In the case of Genentech, it was TPA. And I remember being at that advisory committee meeting. But this was all very, very new. And now you literally have thousands of emerging biotech companies. And I think the complexity of the science, the good news is that our industry has been incredibly innovative. And you look at our industry over the last 30, 40 years, it has created tremendous value, but not without risk. And there are companies that just disappear and blow up. And we're seeing a lot of that right now in the capital markets because it's so difficult for these companies they're serial capital raisers and they can't raise capital now. And if they can raise capital, it's so massively dilutive and painful. So companies are forced to create runway because they don't have enough cash on their balance sheet with their existing cash burn. So they're restructuring, they're firing people, they're cutting out everything that isn't mission critical. And in some cases, they're just not surviving. So you can have a company that hasn't been able to go public, that has an asset that's attractive, but they can't raise cash. And then you have a company who has cash, but their asset blew up. And so a lot of these, what would be called a reverse merge, or a private company reverse merging into a public company, now becoming, the lead public company. And so a lot of this is really just survival. And I think it's all very healthy. And the companies that have good data and teams that are executing are able to raise money. And there's a lot of companies that got public that probably shouldn't have. They were too early, they were undercapitalized, and that's where the massive pain has been.
No, I agree with that.
So I think,
from my side
just
of things,
the investor audience, if you think about, the Perceptives of the world, the RAs, the very successful and well-regarded hedge funds focused on life sciences. They're filled with MDs and PhDs who know the science in and out. And that didn't exist when I started in my career either. Hedge funds didn't really even exist at that time. So I think, and then just the level of competition, things related to the government, whether it be regulatory bodies like the FDA or the FTC or CMS and all of the payers, those things don't tend to be burdens that ease over time. They just mount. And so, we did, at one point we had no PBMs, then we had PBMs. We were never going to have therapeutic substitution. Now we have therapeutic substitution, and that's pretty much, universally accepted as part of the deal. And now we've got new price regulations, evolving, and that will continue. But I think for anyone younger in the business, we talked about all of those things when I started in 1981. So the topic has not changed. And yet, companies are very good at evolving to whatever those regulations are and finding the best path for success, or where the opportunities exist, and those change over time. Immuno-oncology would be one where just crazy amounts of money have been invested over the last 20, 25 years. But as a result of that, there are a lot of people rethinking, should I really be pursuing these opportunities? Because there are 100 people in front of me. What is the chance that I'm either going to be, the best or, the first to market? And so the reprioritization that should and does occur around those kinds of things, is healthy.
Yeah, on the last episode, I had Owen Hughes, who's CEO of Sommer now, but obviously a VC partner in the past, and he spoke about what he looks for in an investment, how other venture capitalists, they often follow the crowd, and immuno-oncology is a perfect example of that, where everyone did. And he actually said, look, Cullinan Oncology, which is the company he founded, was a perfect example where he tried to be against that. They had immuno-oncology assets, but they had a really diverse pipeline, so they didn't have to be only in that. He liked to be a little bit different, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a definitive appetite for following the leader in our business, and I'm not sure that that's not the case throughout life and most industries. And so it's that balance. And I think Owen's right. I mean, I was always often, not always, but often, a massive contrarian in the calls that I would make. And I think sometimes when, markets are terribly efficient. So when people are in possession of 80, 90% of the information, they all lean in and then they all follow each other. And, there's not a lot of opportunity, number one, for a lot of alpha from there. And there's much greater potential for damage, right? Because the expectations tend to get full and maybe overshoot. And that's the way markets tend to work. And so you can get caught in the crosshairs of that. And this is where I go back to, there's no substitute for doing the work. That's just, table stakes for anything, right? And I think that at some point you learn to trust your judgment, and you will call out the elephant in the room, or you will find the little shiny object that no one else saw because they're focused over here, not over there. And so I can think of multiple times where I did that, and ultimately turned out to be right. But I'll tell you, you were alone in the wilderness with that story till everybody started to believe it, and there was more evidence. And in several of them, I was just so convinced, and I just thought people were just traveling down a path of a different time and a belief system that wasn't really valid any longer, right? And some of it was just pragmatic things. Okay, you might not think this is the greatest thing to do, but it's the next best step for this company to take for these reasons. And they will, that kind of thing. But sometimes I always wonder if part of it came from being a young woman in a man's business in the 70s. And so I was never part of the club. I didn't get invited to play golf. Lots of conversations would take place in the men's room. I obviously wasn't there for them. So I didn't feel like I had a club to get kicked out of. I felt like I was just supposed to work really hard and be a truth seeker. And so that's what I did. And if I wasn't following the path, I felt like that was okay. And sometimes I felt like people rested on following the path. That's why they missed that there was another train coming through the station.
And I think that leads perfectly onto the next question, which about Fabulous Pharma Females, which you founded. What inspired you to found Fabulous Pharma Females, and what impact has it had on the industry?
Yeah, it was kind of a couple of things. So I said that, when I started out, you felt very lonely, and I didn't feel like I had, a mentor or even a role model that I could relate to, because there were for so few professional women. I mean, kind of alarmingly so. And at least in my experience in my early 20s, the few women that were successful and that I did respect and admire, I felt like they didn't have a complete and whole life. It was very specific to their career, not married, not having children, not universally, I'm just saying generally. And And I think there was this, nobody spoke about it, but it was kind of like, well, we're in a game of musical chairs, and there's only going to be 1 or 2 chairs for the girls. So I'm going to compete for that seat rather than the tide lifts all boats and let me support. It's not that they didn't, but it's just, you didn't feel like, okay, you look like me. We have similar issues. Let's chat, because maybe we could learn something from one another. It was not that. That's just not what happened. It was like, listen, I'm in this all on my own. I'm suiting up and running down the track, and you figure out your path, kind of thing. And so, as I got older, it was like, oh, I'm starting to meet all these senior women within pharma or portfolio managers or analysts. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. And I felt for the first time like almost, as I said, I was probably approaching 50. And I always felt like I was in this alone. And all of a sudden I felt like I had these women that I got to know well. And I think because we'd all reached some level of success, we were all really comfortable with one another. And then we could share how the issues we faced were different than the men. And many times in common, right? Dealing with being a mother and going to work, traveling half your time, and being a mother. So being successful in your career, but being a mother, and how did you navigate that? And so I started hosting. There was also another thing, like if I was friends with Kristen Pack, who's now the CEO of Zoetis, but at the time she was at Pfizer. Okay. Julie Gerberding at Merck. If I wanted to go to dinner with them and some investors, I would have to have Merck's investor relations come with me, Pfizer's investor relations come with me. They probably wouldn't want to do it. And it would have been a very different, structured, rigid, and the IR person was probably a male. So I just started hosting these salon dinners for women. And it was just a women's dinner. It didn't have anything to do with, they weren't there to extract some secret file from Pfizer or Merck or anything else. And I think that all of us had a similar experience, and it was almost like a bunch of starved cactus in a room. And it was just so warm and enriching. And we talked about everything from, our children in shoes to challenges we're facing, moving up the ladder or whatever it was, or opportunities. There's a ton of men out there that have been importantly responsible for the rise of a lot of successful women. I've seen it. I've benefited from it. So I think, it's unfortunate that sometimes people think that we're held back by the men. I think there are just legacy issues that are reality, but I do think that the better way to approach it is to call out and celebrate the men that actually, are about, they always say this, there's always a woman behind a successful man. Well, there's often a successful man behind a successful woman. Just by definition of, you probably wouldn't have made it if you didn't have men supporting you because they were the lion's share of the seats. And that's, specifically true, in board work now too, right? So it became a thing and everyone just loved it. And they were like, when are you doing your next dinner? And then when I left Wall Street and was no longer a competitor to JP Morgan, I hosted my first sit-down dinner for 52 women at Catonia, and everyone just loved it. And so it just took off from there. Sadly, it kind of stopped with COVID, and I really haven't done anything to rekindle it. But I think it just created a community and a safe space. Yeah. And it was a place where it was actually expected that you would have an ask of your colleagues and that your female colleagues would feel compelled to help you. And most of those women feel very, very strongly that given the opportunities that they had and what they've accomplished, that they owe it to the young girls, women coming in, to support them. And I think the incredibly great news is when I think about young women coming into not just our industry, any industry. a young woman starting in pharma. She can see that Emma Walmsley is the CEO of GlaxoSmithKline. She can see the head of, business development is a woman. And, Yvonne Greenstein, the, CEO of L9, they can see massively successful women, and that can be a North Star. And they actually see the path that they took, and it's one they could take. So I think that's fantastic. I mean, it's flipped the other way that, if you're a male in your 50s, it's really hard to get a board seat. If the opposite is true, I don't think any women are getting board seats because, there's an initiative underway for diversity. Because I think there's so many massively qualified women. But certainly, all things being equal, they're probably going to tilt with the female. I don't think it would ever be the driver.
I actually really agree with what you say, actually, about the board members as well, and there's almost tilting. I obviously see it from a recruitment standpoint.
Yes.
I actually get asked that question specifically. Do you have any great females that could fill a board seat for us? They might have 5 50-plus-year-old men on the board, and they want to tip it, or at least level the playing field, basically, and even it up. So I actually get that quite a lot with people specifically asking.
Being part of that process, because the opposite was true, and witnessing it at multiple boards, I do feel really, really strongly. I mean, I just witnessed it in my career and the people I'm exposed to. There are just so many massively qualified women that want to be on boards who are not yet, and I emphasize yet, on boards. And many of them reach out to me in LinkedIn. And I do a lot of Zoom calls with people who want to know, how did you do that? And I realized when I initiated the process that I wasn't going to get on a board unless I initiated a campaign to get on a board. And that included putting together a document, I call it my board resume, which tells someone why are you qualified and what you actually, from a skill perspective and experience, could contribute to a board. And I'd love to be on the board of Merck, Lilly, and Pfizer, and they could call me anytime they would like me to do that, but they don't need me. And I don't really have anything to contribute to them. The companies that are serial capital raisers, maybe first-time public company CEOs or aspire to be public companies, those are the companies that I can really help and add value. And so those are the ones I'm best positioned to, because you want to contribute, right?
Yeah.
But I think in all of my experiences, and I can think of one search we've had for a specific spot where we were looking for a very, very specific expertise. There was a man and a woman candidate. For a variety of different reasons, the male candidate got it. So I don't think there is this, we're going to take a woman or another minority for those reasons. I think it's that if you want to increase your diversity and you're going to do a search, then you need to include women in that search. Absolutely have to target women in that search. Now, if they don't rise to the top for whatever reasons, okay, that's fine. But I think before these initiatives, there was a tendency to just go out to your friends and family, your colleagues that you worked with. If you were a man, the guys who helped you be successful, you want to bring them in under the tent to help you be successful at this venture. So it's just human nature, and there's nothing wrong with it. And if you don't know the woman well, you never worked with them, and then there's a gentleman that the opposite is true. Well, that's human. But I think we've stretched a bit beyond that. And to me, the most important component of diversity is not the diversity for diversity's sake. It is the fact that the way I will make a decision, the way I will view a situation, how I will problem solve, how I will interact with my colleagues is very much influenced by the fact that I started out at 17 as a woman and had to make my way. Okay. If I started out as a male graduate from Harvard, with all the right pedigree. You know, my experience, my path, my bravery, you know, it probably would be all different. And, you know, if I were dark skinned, it would be different yet again. So I think that's the reason that diversity works. That's the reason why the data shows very, very clearly that diverse boards are more effective and companies with diversity are more successful. And that's why, in my opinion, because otherwise you're all going down, you know, a tunnel together and you have all these blind spots.
Yeah, I could not agree more with everything you just said. Yeah, it makes so much sense. I mean, with every search we do now, we actually give the stats of everyone we've approached and the diversity stats of those people, you know, of the search, you know, how many proportion of female to male, you know, all of those kind of stats. I think it's really important that, you know, everyone is given equal opportunity and, you know, approached in the right way and so on. So I could not agree more with what you say. And yeah, it's become a big thing for me and my mindset and the way I do my job as well, which I think has come over the years and everything's changing in for a really positive way.
And I see it in my boards because it's interesting how different people with an orientation or experience will come at a problem. And I feel like the more diversity that we have around the table, the more we do really get the 360 and the more able we are to have a conversation where everyone feels that they have an invitation to contribute. Even if it is just to say, I hear what you're saying, I largely agree, but have you thought about this? And I remember an experience sitting with a group, an executive team, and the CEO said, I think we should give the following guidance. And we were a pretty tight group, had worked together for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. And then went down the line and each and every one of these gentlemen said, I agree, I think we should do that. And after that, I just said, are you crazy? I went into all the reasons why I thought that was a horrible, horrible idea. Not to be insulting, and it was largely because of, you know, I've had the root canals performed on me for, you know, I have all the scars from that over 40 years. I know, you know, and so ultimately we didn't give that guidance. And that guidance wouldn't have been a little bit wrong or really wrong. It would have been massively wrong. And it wasn't that I was any, you know, smarter than them but I lived in that world and was like, no, you cannot do that. So we didn't, thank God. And had we, I would have been the one that, you know, people would have been crucifying for it. So, I mean, those are just examples. And I've had many where it's the other way, you know, where I would have a point of view and then my colleagues would explain based on an experience that they had that was very similar, which I did not have. And I'd be like, yeah, I didn't think about that. And you're right. That's a good point. And it also goes to this groupthink thing, you know, and there is that tendency, and you have to poke the bear a little bit in a conversation. And it's okay if in the end it doesn't change anyone's decisions or conclusions or whatever, but at least there was air cover to raise that issue and that it would be heard. And then collectively you might, you know, it wouldn't change anything. And I that happens more often than not, but then everybody thought about it and maybe it would change the way you approached it or the timing in which you approached it or how you communicated. What was the narrative around why did we make this decision, you know?
Yeah, no, yeah, couldn't agree more. Avetix here, you know, at the moment we're a leadership team of 3 men. and we often make decisions about what we're going to do and how we're going to build this company. And I actually share those opinions with my girlfriend, and she often does similar things. Which, really, are you going to do that? And then she'll say, give her opinion. Like, I never even thought of that. And it's just little things like that that just shows the different mindsets and different backgrounds. And yeah, you're right in everything you say. And I think,
well, it's like,
even from
when you said that, telling your girlfriend, it just made me think about, the most basic of human life. I guess there's a reason that God gave us a mother and a father, right?
Yeah.
I don't think there necessarily, there may be a big Venn diagram there but they're not, redundant for sure.
100%. But yeah, look, moving on to the next topic, for young professionals aspiring to make a difference in healthcare capital markets, what advice would you give them based on your own experiences?
Well, I think the most basic and fundamental of them is I was never the smartest person in the room. I was never the most well-educated person in the room. But and a lot of those things you can't control. I mean, you can refine your skills, you can get smarter, you can study. There's a lot of things you can do, but and most of us did do those things to varying extents. But everybody can work hard. Everyone can work hard. Everyone can be that person that when you say you're going to do something, you do it. And they know that when they show up, because we've all decided we're going to get to the office at 6:00, they know you're going to be there. Not like, oh, geez, where's Barbara? I thought she said she was going to be here to do this, that, or the other thing. And that's what builds respect and trust. And there's very little that you can accomplish in a career, in an organization, or independently, in my case, with clients, if you don't have those basic characteristics in your relationship. So I would say, yes, when you start in your first job, and I can remember this vividly, and I could also see it in young people that I hired, they thought they were supposed to know what I was going to have them do or know what I know. And I didn't have any expectation that they knew what I was going to have them do. I just wanted to know that they were a good learner, good athlete, and that they were going to just roll up their sleeves and do the work. So I think those are really basic, and they define in the early years how your colleagues, and specifically your equals and the people far senior to you, perceive you. And in my business, having to make a call, Merck's a buy, Merck's a sell. Pfizer's going to buy Warner Lambert, whatever it is. Knowing that you did the work, you did not just wing it. And I need to make a call, so let me just make this call. And having, again, the work. It's like when we were in school and they'd say, show your work when you were solving an equation, right? Please show your work, because I want to understand that you actually got to the right answer by knowing what the work was to do that. And so, it's kind of showing your work. I mean, I'm making this call. My model is above consensus, below consensus, and here's why. Here's the assumptions, behind it. Bring people along on the journey, because you will be wrong sometimes. But if people thought, wow, that makes total sense to me, I completely agree with that, I would think that's the path of least resistance is going to happen. And if something changes and it's like, gosh, I didn't think that would happen, now that's happened, it's changed the whole thesis. Now what do we do? So I think as you gain trust and respect, by definition, you will be rising in your career and getting more responsibility, exposed to more people, and have additional opportunities. But you're never going to get those without those things that I just said. So I think those are the most basic things, because it's unlikely that when you're young and you're cutting your teeth, that everyone's going to say, oh my God, they're the smartest person here. How are they so brilliant? How did they know what to do? Because it's not really where you're going to win early on. Later on, sure, that's absolutely where you will win. But so I think, my father told me when I went to work initially at Bear Stearns. He said, you treat the secretaries the same way you treat your boss. And I'm not even sure if he realized that that was profound or thought about it. I bet he's no longer with us, but I bet if I asked him, he probably would be like, I did. But it really struck me. So, when I worked for Joe and Lucille had to go to the copy machine, and I could tell like the shit was hitting the fan, and she had to attend to Joe or something else, or his phone was ringing off the hook, I'd be like, here, give me that. I'll go make the copies. At the end of the day, successful people figure out where the white space is and they fill it in. Because half the time people around you, and this is absolutely true at my clients and companies I'm on the board, because they're so cash strapped, resource constrained from talent as well. And so there's all kinds of things that could be done, should be done, but aren't, because everybody's in the urgency quadrant most of the time and doing today's must-have, right? And I remember one client, when I left, I literally had to write a multi-page document because it was all the stuff I did behind the scenes that they didn't even know. They didn't need to know. I don't need to take credit for it. And a lot of them were just mundane, like making sure that the description on the CNBC app of the company was accurate. And they never were. And I would have to write 3 or 4 emails to CNBC to get them corrected, and attach like press releases documenting how they weren't up to date, right? Am I going to go tell the CEO, you know what I did yesterday? Blah, 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 blah. But those things all, if someone goes and their first orientation is they hear about a company and they go look at their app, and then they look at the company description and it's inaccurate, that's not helpful. If you go to a website and it's not updated, like there's a new board member and he's not even on it, or one board member, she left and she's still on it, or the CFO. I mean, it's just silly little things like that. And I think that, not being above, we're all on the same team. And, if the organization looks bad, we all do too. And so, and then the other is, I think, taking responsibility as you do rise in your career, taking responsibility, like the old adage, the buck stops here. So when I would publish a report, and I would have a team, and maybe we all took different lanes in putting that together. At the end of the day, their names will be undermined, but it's my report and I'm responsible. And if there's a mistake, it's my mistake, irrespective of who made it, because I should have caught it or not just accepted something as read, right? So I think, that's another element that, sometimes isn't the easiest thing to do. And I learned early on as well that the time to be most visible when I was an analyst was when I was wrong. Nobody cares. Yeah. You recommended the stock, it went up. The client was smart enough to buy it. The sales force was smart enough to make the call. It had nothing to do with you. And when you make a call and things go sideways or off the rails altogether, which, I was recommending Merck when they pulled Vioxx. It was ugly. That's when you don't dial into the morning call. You show up, and you show up prepared for people to stab you with knives, shoot you with bullets because they're angry and upset and billions of dollars are trading hands. And because the next time you make a call, they need to know that when things go wrong, there's someone on the other end of the phone. And I would have the same comments around a company. So if I stuck my neck out and was recommending stock, that's on me. But I'm not going to do that for a company that the only time they're going to answer my calls when things are going well. But now when they halted trading and the news has been disseminated and they can't reopen because there's such an imbalance between sell orders and buy orders, I need to know that they're going to take my call. I don't need them to tell me anything out of school, but I do need to know that I can go to my sales force and I can go to Fidelity and say, look, I spoke, to the CFO here, here's whatever it is, so I just think those are not at all specific or skill related. I just think that I think there are very few people, unless they are totally brilliant, right? Or totally political. I think there are very few people that have been really successful without delivering on those things. The worst sign when you hire someone, all of a sudden they're calling in sick all the time or late. You just sit there and go, I just don't think this is going to work.
Yeah, 100%. Look, it's been an amazing podcast. I really thank you for coming on. I've enjoyed every topic. So thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you, Max. I appreciate it.
No problem. And please subscribe, like the BioHub. Amazing. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.